Welcome to the Live Your Possible podcast, the show about sparking and discovering endless possibilities where we work, live, and play. A safe place where we can help you peel back the cover to what may be blocking you from being your most authentic and happiest self.
I'm excited to welcome back Yvonne Alston from Indelible Impressions Consulting. We talked after our last episode in episode 4 about shame. And as a result, we agreed to discuss this openly in a safe place where Yvonne could vulnerably open up about the shame she carried around. She talks about it like it was an overloaded backpack of items she was wearing and it was holding her down. Yvonne found ways to escape by putting her mind somewhere else and solving mysteries in Nancy Drew novels. Over time, she also learned to take ownership of her shame, let go of what was not hers, and to figure out how to live onward always. Please take a listen and help me make this episode a judgment-free one to allow us to pause and reflect on addressing any shame that you carry around. Yvonne, welcome back. It's great to see you again. I've been looking forward to this conversation because we can certainly talk about many topics, and we started to cover one at the end of our first podcast recording together, and we both agreed we thought it would make sense for us to get back together. So first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be back with you. I thought it was a very rich conversation. I felt completely comfortable. So thank you for that. I felt like there was psychological safety, right, that allowed for me to be brave and transparent. And so thank you for creating that environment. So I look forward to anything that you and I talk about next. Let's get after it.
Well, I appreciate all of that. And certainly your vulnerability. You're unapologetically authentic, as we know. So I appreciate that as well. And, one of the topics we started to chat about was around shame. In the first talk, we talked a bit about, your legacy and, you're growing up with your family and your mom in particular, we talked about, and it was a beautiful set of stories, and your connections you made were amazing. And I'd love to pick up where we left off. And what is shame to you? And what's going on?
So I would say shame, for me, I don't have any clinical definition, right? I'm not Brene Brown, and I think she has an amazing perspective and definition of shame. But for me, I would say that it's any time that I have felt not good about myself or my lived experiences or even professional experiences that oftentimes translated into devaluing my character, my choices, or my intellect in very unproductive ways. Sometimes they were based on things that I may have done or said, or where I was subject to things that other people had done or said. And so that's how I look at shame.
How does that show up for you today when you think about it?
I think I have a very healthy relationship now with shame. There was a time that I didn't. There was a time that shame, perhaps because of, my late mother's struggles, right, with addiction and other things, that I wouldn't talk about her, or I wouldn't engage with her because of shame, right? I wouldn't invite her places because her struggles were evident to others, right? So I felt shame about her choices and where she was at and the illnesses that she had. Not to say that addictions are a choice, right? There's usually something that precipitates those behaviors, and seeking out other things in order to numb hurts and pains or coping mechanisms and things like that. But when I was a youth, I didn't understand that. I just felt ashamed that my mother was in this state of life. I think shame for where my family was at financially, right? And how we lived and where we lived. It was fine when I was among my peers who lived in the same places and understood what it was like to live in financial hardship like that. But again, shame, I would never have certain friends over, kind of thing. Those kind of things. I think as I came to be an adult, I started to understand people more. I certainly started to understand the ebbs and flows of life and what contributes to certain decisions and certain situations that people find themselves in. And so I learned over time, and certainly through therapy, to kind of unpack all of that and to only put back in my metaphorical rucksack, if you will. That's a military term for the big green backpack that they have. What I owned, what was mine, to be in my own rucksack, and how I was taking and putting other things in there that did not belong to me. That was one way, working through all of that. That was one way to release shame in a really healthy way.
That's a great metaphor that you're sharing as you think about it's being, packed on our back, and think about that, how heavy that is, that you're carrying it around with you, and how it might be holding us back or limiting, potentials or opportunities or possibilities, and or how we're being judged, or how we might judge the world, or how we think things are happening to us. I can only imagine how it really limits our life. It limits us, holds us back. And in some ways, maybe it drains us. And I guess as you kind of reflect on that, the heavier version of this backpack, how does that resonate? How did that impact you? Maybe it was when you were younger, or maybe as you look back, how did that impact you over time?
I think when I was younger, I would keep to myself. I would do a lot of reading. And I think we talked about this last time. I can't recall if this was more interpersonal or if this was on the podcast, but I had mentioned how I loved books, right? And books were an escape for me. What I've since realized is that I had this affinity for Nancy Drew books, right? These mysteries. And now I understand as an adult why I love them so much. Part of that was, I think, trying to solve problems, right, within people's interactions. And I think that was a part of what I was trying to do in my own life. So the book would allow me not only an escape from my current world and what I was living in, but also I understand why I was so drawn to that particular genre of books, was because it allowed myself in Nancy's shoes to solve problems, things that I just could not solve in my own life at that point. So there was that. I think I mentioned about not having people come over. I also think that I saw myself very limited in terms of my capabilities because my surroundings said so, whether that was evidentiary because of the environment or those were the words that I heard. You're never going to be more than this or this or this, because those were the limiting beliefs of individuals who were in my environment, my family environment. So of course, how is it possible that they would see me as going beyond that when they couldn't even see beyond that for themselves? Yeah. And I think it took me a long time to get beyond that. I always had something to prove because of the shame. I needed to prove that I was strong because the shame messaging was horrible things happen to you because you're weak. Horrible things, this, that, or the third, maybe being in a physically violent relationship as a teenager, right? Succumbing to that, thinking that I was weak, and then being furtherly shamed, right? That not only did I grow up in an environment where this was okay, but now I actually find myself oddly in a place, in a space where there's physical violence in a romantic relationship at such a young age, somewhere I never thought that I would be. And so a lot of additional shame, right? So again, we talk about the rucksack. I had plenty to gather and throw in over and over and over again, to the point where there was probably a season where I wasn't quite sure who I was outside of those experiences, or didn't see what I could be for those experiences.
There's a lot there, and I could totally understand, the desire to read and to get into these mysteries with Nancy Drew and the stories there, because I can only imagine the stories you were telling yourself through the time, all the different things that were happening around you, and the shame that you were feeling. And I feel for you, because you were having to answer unnecessary questions that were put on you and fight back, literally, it sounds like, through violence and unnecessary actions. And I can't imagine, how you got through that. And, having that escape and solving the problems at the moment. Thank God you did. And you kind of look forward and As you kind of look back, how did you hold it together? How did you work through that?
As a youth, I don't think productively. I was very angry. And I myself, I think defensively met sometimes violence with violence, right? Because it became a survival mechanism. I also learned how to make myself very small, right? When we talk about as adults, like in the work world and some of the work I do with Indelible about assimilation, right? I was constantly having to calibrate to assimilate to the environment as a survival mechanism. And so this is what I think, even going into the adult life and being at an institution like Quinnipiac, or going and working for organizations where I was one of the few, I had learned the power of assimilation and then also code switching very early in life. But what that yielded was, certainly, I think, as I started to become of age and an adult, an identity crisis of like, who are you outside of these experiences? Who are you outside of what others pigeonholed you to be and people told you were going to be, whether that was positive or negative? Who the heck are you, Yvonne Marie? Right? And doing the work to figure that out.
Yeah, there's a few layers to that, as I'm thinking too, is we're told to be, or we're not something, or we're asked to live a different life or look a certain way to fit into certain cultures, to fit into different business models even, and it's like we've talked about this quite a bit around authenticity. Like, how can we be our full selves, our authentic selves, if we're being told and we have to act a certain way or be a certain person? And I think a lot of this, as I'm hearing you talk through this, a lot of this is perception. It felt like some of the shame, albeit some of it is real and some of it is violent, there's some level of perception and how others might judge you or judge us, in certain situations. And then the doubt and the shame, why you? Like, why are you being treated that way? Or why are you being held back or told a certain thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I will say, like, as I became an adult and entered the working world, when we talk about like assimilating to the environment, part of that as a Black woman was not sharing those experiences with colleagues, right? Or certainly anything that I felt could be weaponized against me and become more of a barrier, because I already had enough hurdles ahead of me, right? Being one of the few, if not the only, on teams and so forth. So I already had kind of, in a lot of respects, the deck stacked against me. And so I wasn't going to give anyone more ammunition, right? And that's the way I saw it. So it wasn't this, so to speak, outward defensiveness, but internally, in my heart, in my mind, there are things that how I wanted to show up authentically and unapologetically. So for it, but didn't feel the safety there. And I think that's something that a lot of people grapple with in the workplace and even in family structures. I remember when I met my husband, Derek, who you've had the pleasure of briefly meeting, looks forward to more time to talk with you.
Totally.
Even when getting into a relationship with him, I was very nervous about sharing certain things about my past because of something you brought up just a few moments ago, right? Judgment, right? Is he going to look and say, hey, I think, I feel like she's attractive and she's smart, but she comes with a lot of baggage. And do I want to be part of that? Do I want to bring that into my life? There might be other great things that she brings to my life, but if she's bringing all of her, she brings that too. And I was really worried about that, as to how he might view that and how that would impact our relationship. The great thing is that that's not who he is. And he allowed me to unpack my stuff. And I told him about the work that I've done in therapy over the years and so forth, with both unpacking and taking accountability. And so I think that, if anything, he has shared with me how much he admires my strengths, my persevering spirit, how my faith has grown and evolved, and to be part of my unapologetically authentic identity. now and understands like where I'm at, why I do what I do, how I do it. And that he shares with me the perspective that everything is purposeful. I say I would not be as effective, as unapologetically authentic, as empathetic and compassionate as I am, but for those experiences. So while I don't say, yay, and celebrate that I went through all that, I do celebrate the outcomes for me and where it's brought me to.
Well, first of all, Derek is pretty special. He's great. I can look forward to connecting with him more. Well, I mean, he wants you to be you. He wants the full
Yes.
you. He's not looking for a part of you because, as we get to relationships, it just doesn't work. Being part of someone, you can't fake it for that long. We need to be who we are. There's some people, they go into relationships and say, I got to be in it for at least 2 years so I could actually experience everything. Right. I mean, it's kind of silly to think about it that way.
Yeah. Well, because we've been socialized, right? To I call it sending your representative.
Yeah.
Right. So you're sending your representative to engage with folks, knowing that's not who you really are. And you're then forced at some point to choose, am I going to live with a mask?
Yeah.
Or when can I show other parts of myself and who I really am? And will that be accepted? Right. Yeah. Or will I slip up and they'll find out anyway? So, yeah.
I think you mentioned Brene Brown, you talk about vulnerability, and we both believe stepping into that and doing that with the right intentions to share, to be fully transparent, with good intentions. You're going to get people to pick you up. Like I've mentioned in the past, people have picked me up when I've had my shortcomings, and my share of guilt, which is different than shame, because Brene talks in that talk about the difference of shame and guilt. And you're talking largely about shame, which is about self and your perceptions and things that you're dealing with, struggling with, things that are in your backpack that you've, unpacked what you want to own and keep, and other things that are more perception that you're trying to push away, which is a beautiful message. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you did that. Where on the guilt side is, from what Brene says, and I'll attach the link to the talk because I think it's worth sharing, is he gets into the idea that it's basically our behaviors. Like when we recognize that our behaviors are the actions that we took that were not what we wanted or should do, then we should have a little bit of guilt. And I, honestly, when I went through my awakening, I had a bit of both. That getting that clarity from her and how she looks at the differences helped me understand about what I had to break through, what I had to learn about my own shame, and what I had to overcome in my behaviors going forward, which is really important to know the distinction of the two. So how did you work through it yourself? Like, how did you work through, unpacking and getting yourself to a point where you're carrying a lighter load and you could actually be the current day Nancy Drew, solving puzzles and working with people and making connections and talking about, indelible impressions all day long?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I mentioned therapy. That was definitely key. Finding someone that you can be kind of undone in front of, right? That is a place without judgment. And I think also that's important, as well as one's willingness to take responsibility and own what you need to own, and also not own what is not yours to own. And that was a process of learning that, right? Especially when it comes to family members and certain experiences. I'll akin this to that romantic relationship, that intimate partner violence, as I now understand the terminology to be. Part of that was I felt shame for, I made him angry, or I was snarky, or I did something that resulted in his inappropriate behavior, right? And that I had carried forth from my family relationship, right? That I made somebody angry. I made them, right? No accountability on their own part. So whether they exercise that verbally or in physical violence, I was always the instigator, if you will, right?
Okay.
So carrying that mentality forward into that intimate partner relationship, I felt the same way. So it was always like, I made this happen. I said or did something, I'm to blame. And so starting to dissect that and analyze that and understanding that both the familial and the intimate partner relationships, that was somebody else's stuff. That was somebody else's rationalization. That was someone else's lack of accountability, right? That was someone else putting that upon me because they felt shame for what they had done. So rather than acknowledging their behaviors, and like you said, the difference between guilt and shame, I don't know that back then any of us, I will say myself or those that I was around, really understood the difference. I would say that, definitely it became clear to me through therapy that it was their shame that was causing them to blame me and then to exert violence, either violent words or violent actions towards me or upon me. And so I had to really unpack that, and I had to ironically stop centering myself in the narrative as much as this was about them. And as long as I kept centering myself in the narrative, I, in my head and heart, had culpability. And so I needed to decenter myself from that, to say, if the guy had a bad day, it was mad about something else and exerted that against me, that was about power and control. That was his thing. I just ended up being an outlet for that. I could have said, hi, how was your day? And trying to engage in conversations or whatever. And the same result would occur as if I had said something really awful and something that could incite a disagreement, right? At least at a minimal verbal one, right? But it didn't matter. It was his stuff. And so I needed to learn how to do that. And I think that again, trying to keep that going forward in life, I think it's been very important. It actually helped to inform one of my principles to my daughter as she grew up in, teenage years, and people are talking about me at school and there's a rumor and all this kind of stuff that teenagers go through. The next iteration of that learning looked like fact versus fiction. And so I would try to work with her to say, okay, what are you really upset about? And let's do the chart. What do you know to be fact and what is fiction? And helping her to be able to discern between the two so that she herself could own what she needs to own, right? And not own the stories that other people were saying about her, or even the stories she was telling herself that, again, were based on fiction and not fact.
Yeah, then the stories, back to the stories we tell ourselves, sometimes are not based in fact. It's based on what people told us, the way we should feel, it's our fault. We kind of jump the order, if you will, because I think you're spot on. It's like, okay, what are the facts in the case? What's the situation at hand? Albeit as part of that step, we have to be honest with ourselves and own our stuff, to your point. Exactly what you're saying. I'm just reinforcing in a different way. Just, we have to own it, because if we don't trust what we're bringing, then how the heck can we really trust the other side of what they're saying for real?
Absolutely, 100%, right? And I think it's interesting to me because for many folks, accountability goes hand in hand with defense of, right? And for me, accountability is like a breath of fresh air, right? I don't have this desire to be and exist in perfection. I know that I'm human. I know that I will make mistakes. So there's no need for me to ever feel like if I misstep in some way in life or in dialogues or whatever, that I go back to beating myself up about those things. Instead, it's, oh yeah, I missed the mark on that. Yeah, I did. And I apologize. And I can take accountability for whatever the impact was to someone else in their life, regardless of my intent, right? The impact is what matters most, but without this throwing it back in my rucksack, right? And letting that weigh me down, but acknowledging, taking accountability, and then moving on quickly to do better, etc. Right? And just go back at it. And I think that, as human beings, sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to be the most perfect version of ourselves. And the truth is that doesn't exist.
Yeah, you're right. I think there's different expectations. And, Brene talks about that too, right? We're trying to look at ourselves and having this perfect life. We all do it. As men, it's, we're taught to hold things in and I guess in some ways be emotionless in some ways. And I know that folks that are not dealing with emotions well, they take it out in violence or they take it out in inappropriate actions. And in large part, when you think about society with things that are going on, I mean, there's definitely a crisis in the world with how people are holding these emotions and what they're doing about it and how they're unleashing it on other people. And it's sad. And other people have not been as fortunate as you, Yvonne, as far as how you're working through this and unpacking and taking the steps forward. In fact, I think you even have a reminder, I think, on your wrist, possibly.
Yes.
So what does that say?
Onward always, right? And this is new ink, right? For me, I just got it recently, last Saturday, as a matter of fact. And I did it intentionally because I was reflecting on life and so many of the things that I've had the privilege and the blessing to live through and come on to the other side of. And the one thing that has been incredibly consistent throughout is this concept I always had of brush it off, keep it moving, not brush it off that it doesn't matter, but kind of brush the dust and the debris and whatever from you from the time that you were in the situation, maybe in the fight. And I don't mean that physically, but more so as a metaphor, right? In this fight of life, brush it off, get back up, keep moving. It is former President Theodore Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech, which I have always loved because I've always seen myself that way. And also had the privilege and the blessing of seeing my mom that way in her latter years and before she passed away. So the new version or the language for that for me is onward always, right? And so this is a beautiful reminder to me of where I've been, where I am, and where I'm going. And while I don't know all the answers for the future, the one thing that I do know is that my heart and mind and soul are purposed to move onward always, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't feel like I'm going to make it through this other thing. And yet I do, miraculously to me. I do. And so this is just, for me, it's just a beautiful reminder.
Yeah, it's a small step that you could take. I mean, there's other things that folks can remind ourselves, like I have my pink pen, right? It's my reminder of being accountable to welcoming differences and understand what that's about. There's deep meaning there. There's so many things we could cover here around this topic. And, I appreciate you vulnerably sharing. And for folks, I really want us to look at, shame in a certain way and to address it with compassion, for ourselves and for each other. It's so important that we actually look at that and not blame ourselves, Yvonne, like you've been saying, right? You're looking at it to say, what about this is your stuff, and own, what can I do about it? How do I move forward? You're not ignoring it. You're looking at ways to make it better, right? Last time we talked about don't be bitter, be better, change that approach. I think that having empathy for what situation you are in and where you have been and connecting back to that and solving problems like you did with Nancy Drew in the novels and like you're doing today, and accepting who you are, being, showing you are your authentic self and you are where you are based on your learnings and you're continuing to get better is such an important learning as well. And I have one last question. It's like, have you given forgiveness? Is forgiveness part of the equation? Oh,
I'm so glad you brought that up. That is a huge part. That's a huge part of moving forward. And I dare say bringing you to the place where you can know the difference between shame and guilt, right? I have come to understand as it relates to my mother and my family that oftentimes people do the best for what they know at the time, right? And I also know that my mom's growing up had a particular kind of history that presented more opportunity for her to go the pathway that she did. right? More opportunity than there should have been for her to go the pathway that she did. So forgiveness is huge. Forgiveness of others as much as forgiveness of ourselves, right? And I think that that's really important. Forgiveness of others is not about letting them off the hook. Forgiveness, I dare say, is for you, the individual, right? Who was perhaps negatively impacted by something someone else said or did. When we live in unforgiveness, some people say, oh, well, that's the fire in my belly that keeps me moving ahead. Well, that could also be the prison that keeps you from experiencing life and joy and becoming the most beautiful, authentic version of yourself. And so forgiveness is for you, right? And if you can understand that, and then again, also understand that most people don't come out the gate in life and wanting to harm other people, right? With their words or deeds. People make mistakes. And so can you forgive that they did the best they do for at the time? And now if they were to look back in hindsight, they probably would do things a heck of a lot different. So forgiveness is key, forgiveness of others, as well as forgiveness of yourself.
Perfectly said. Thanks for sharing all of this. And I know you've been recently added to I think it's the Interval House board, which is addressing many elements of the violence that you're referring to today. So congrats on that. And
Thank you.
Thanks for stepping in and paying it forward there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I will tell you that I've never shared it outwardly as much about in that I have in the last year about the family violence and intimate partner violence, or even about going to therapy. And I gotta tell you, it just feels so because it's a part of my story, right? And it's, I think for Interval House, being able to say, have people look at me and go, wow, and yet you're still here and you're doing this work. And I think that that's really important to know that this may not be, if it is someone's situation, hopefully, prayerfully, will not be always, right? And you'll be able to look back and you'll derive growth, grace, and strength from it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And just again, you get that load that's on your back. It's been lightened because you're being you, authentically you, unapologetically, authentically you. And you're amazing. And thanks for sharing your story. And we'll keep chatting. We'll be back again, I'm sure. And keep doing what you're doing. You're making an impact on so many levels and with so many people. Keep, what's your phrase? Is it onward always? Is that what it is?
Onward always.
Right, there we go. We'll talk soon. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Darrin.
Yes. Yvonne did it again. She opened up her heart to help us all, this time to cope with the shame that shows up in our life. Consider the following ideas and steps we learned from today's show. I love how she read Nancy Drew novels as her escape when she was younger and practiced solving mysteries in her imaginary world as a way to gain the skills to solve them in her real life as an adult. Now, she is the current day version of Nancy Drew, helping other humans solve complex issues and puzzles through her company, Indelible Impressions, and all the boards that she's on where she's paying it forward and giving back. Now, Yvonne points out how important it is to come to grips with our own shame, separating fact versus fiction, and not accepting others' perceptions or issues as our shame, and to do the work on what we really need to own. So we need to be brutally honest with ourselves to figure out where we can let go and where we can actually fix things going forward. Another thing we covered near the end was to make sure we forgive others where you can, because you're not only freeing of the situation in your mind, you're freeing yourself of the shame and baggage weighing you down here. If you can't, consider speaking with a therapist, a professional about how to set yourself, giving compassion to yourself and others. Now support the Interval House, where Yvonne is giving back. She's the newly appointed board member addressing domestic and intimate partner violence. Yvonne has been pretty vulnerable here, and she's openly paying it forward. She admits it's part of her story, and she's not ashamed of it anymore, where now she's willing to talk about it and help others heal by getting involved. Now think about ways you can pay it forward in areas where you might have felt shame to gain more comfortable in overcoming and breaking through so you can help others along the way too. I promise you, it'll give you joy in the end. Now, what is your slogan to keep pushing through these tough moments, these dark days, or when we go out to that imaginary world? Now, Yvonne showed us her slogan is onward always. Now, think about that. Jot some ideas. What are some words What are some slogans you can live by? As you know, I like to live your possible and to ignite happy. So remember, I believe there's a beautiful light inside of all of us. Ignite it and live your possible.
That's all for today's episode. If you liked the show, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Live Your Possible dares to unlock your fullest potential and become an avenue for others to do the same. Join the community by visiting ignitehappy.com. It's time to discover endless possibilities with equal opportunity for all. See you again next week for more insights on how you can live your possible.